And resentment and bitterness is a poison in the soul that destroys. It settles into our hearts.
The disciples also wondered and asked Jesus, "What is the Father like?"
Over and over I've fallen. Over and over you say, living true.
This is Living Truth. Throughout history, mankind has attempted to understand and explain God. The disciples also wondered and asked Jesus, "What is the Father like?" In today's message, Charles Price will revisit the parable of the two sons, often called the prodigal son, as he takes a closer look at the older son. This parable reveals the Father's heart towards both his boys. This is Living Truth.
I'm going to read you from Luke chapter 15. And you remember that this chapter is given over to stories of lost sheep, a lost coin, and lost sons. Let me read the opening 2.5 verses. Now the tax collectors and scribes were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And then Jesus told them this parable. First, the parable of a sheep farmer had 100 sheep. He counted them in one night. There were only 99. Went out searching until he found the one that was lost. And then he talked about a woman who had 10 coins and one went missing, and she searched everywhere, turned the house upside down. Eventually, she found the coin. And then, having told those two stories, Jesus then told the main story of this passage, which is about two sons. And the younger son, you remember, got his share of the inheritance that would come from his father when his father died. His share would be 1/3. The elder son had 2/3 because he had to maintain the estate and pass it to the next generation, whereas the younger son could take it all in cash, and he did. And he went off to far countries, squandered it, and eventually ended up in a pig pen, feeding pigs, would have eaten the pig food himself. You can't imagine a more humiliating state for a Jewish boy than that. And in the pig pen, he decided, "I want to go home." And he came back to his father, was welcomed back. You remember, the other son is the older son, in whom the future of the family estate resided. He stayed at home, he worked hard, he never disobeyed. And yet, when the younger son came home, he was thrown into a dilemma. Why is it this younger son squanders everything, and yet he is welcomed back, and here am I, who have done nothing wrong, who have never even given a party to celebrate my being here? And the interesting twist in this story is that the younger son starts off as the villain and ends up as the hero. The older son starts off as the hero and ends up as the villain. And we looked at the younger son last week. I want to look at the older son a little bit this week. The older son gets the bad press, interestingly, because it's the young son who blows his portion of the inheritance, and when he comes home, sometime later, having come to the end of himself, an absolute mess, when he came home, the older son says to his father in verse 29, "Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command." The ideal son. The son of whom the neighbors say, "Man, I wish I had a son like that." He served him all his life. He never disobeys him. He starts work on time. He finishes on time. And he represents the scribes and Pharisees. And I want to understand with you why that is, and then you'll see how this becomes pertinent and relevant to us here now. In the spirit of the eldest son, here in Luke 15 and verse 29, when the younger son came home and the elder son was all uptight, he said to his father in verse 29, "These many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command." And every Pharisee would say that of his relationship with God, his relationship to the law. "These many years I served you, I never disobeyed your law." However, so deep was the commitment of the Pharisees to holiness, and they developed a doctrine of what I'll call a doctrine of contamination. That is, that in the Old Testament, things were categorized as being clean or being unclean, and the unclean things must not be touched by the clean things. If they do, the clean things will become unclean. You see it? In other words, the unclean spreads, and the clean becomes contaminated. You find this in Leviticus, you find this in parts of Deuteronomy. They believed the bad would contaminate the good, and they applied this spiritually and morally. So the doctrine of contamination meant they led to separation from sin, and from that, isolation from sinners. And this is the real concern when Jesus is receiving sinners and eating with them. Doesn't he know about this principle of contamination? Doesn't he know that if he, as a clean man, sits with a dirty man, he becomes dirty? Doesn't he know that? Well, the great thing is that Jesus came to demonstrate a reversal of that. You notice that Jesus touched lepers. Nobody's supposed to touch lepers, but whenever Jesus deals with lepers, he touches them. And when Jesus touches lepers, they're healed. Not the unclean contaminates the clean, but the clean infiltrates the unclean. It's the other way around. When Jesus spoke to dead bodies, they would come to life. When a woman who'd been bleeding for 38 years crept up behind him in the crowd and touched him, she was healed. So under this new covenant, it's not that the unclean contaminate the clean, but the clean affect the unclean, and the clean infiltrate the unclean. So Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "You are the salt of the earth. Salt is no good sitting in its packaging." Primary use of salt in that day was to prevent decay, and so you would cake meat in salt. And when I lived in Africa years ago, we had meats that were caked in salt to preserve them. And the salt was intended to infiltrate that which is potentially unclean for the purpose of actually keeping it clean, bringing purity. It says, "You are the light of the world." Well, a light is only of value if it's shining in darkness. A light in light is of no help. Light has to be in the darkness. I remember when I was a little boy, I had a brother, and I remember he asked my mother one night, don't know why I remember this, but I do remember this, when she switched the light off, he said, "Mum, why when the light goes off does all the darkness come rushing in through the window?" And the answer, of course, is when the light is switched on, all the darkness goes rushing out of the window. Now, said Jesus, you've been scared of the dark ever since Moses. You've been scared of the corruption ever since Moses. Now, under the new covenant, this principle reverses. It's not contamination you need to fear, it is infiltration you need to practice. Which is why the commission is to go into all the world. That was never a commission under the old covenant. They built the walls around Israel to protect themselves. Now you go into the world. Now you take this life and you transfer it to those that are dead, and you bring life. And so if under the Old Testament natural laws, the clean became unclean, by Jesus, the sinners become clean. The unrighteous become righteous. The sick become healthy. The dead are made alive again. So in Matthew 10, when Jesus sent out his disciples that first time, he said to them, "The kingdom of heaven is near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, and drive out demons." And all those four things were forbidden things up until now. But this time you go to the sick and don't get sick. You heal them. You go to those who are dead and raise them from dead. You go to those who have leprosy and cleanse them. You go to the demons and you drive them out. Don't fear contamination. Pursue intervention into their lives. Now, the Pharisees, of course, had a strong doctrine of contamination. So that led to a strong doctrine of separation from sin, which led in turn to an even stronger doctrine of isolation from sinners. And so they measured their value by the way they kept outside of those who were sinful or unclean. And so their values became external ones, of course. Their concern for holiness was an imposed one from the outside. It became, don't do this and do that, and don't do the other thing. And they're driven by what my wife Hillary calls the tyranny of shoulds, where Christians should do this and should do that and shouldn't do the other and aren't supposed to do that. That's not how you live the Christian life. On the basis of shoulds, a Christian life on the basis of things you should do, you will become in due course a phony. You'll become what the Pharisees themselves became, on the street corners, praying to be seen by men, Matthew 6 says. Giving, but to be seen by men, in Matthew 6. Fasting, but to be seen by men. Because I should do this, so why should I? So that people know I'm in. And getting rid of the shoulds in our lives and understanding the antidote to them is vital to spiritual health. What is the antidote? Well, the other Pharisee that came to see Jesus was a man called Nicodemus. In John chapter 3, he came to Jesus at night and he said, Rabbi, we know you're a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the miraculous signs you are doing if God were not with him. In other words, it says Nicodemus, Jesus, there are things about you that cannot be explained apart from the fact God is with you. And Jesus answered him, I tell you the truth, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again. Unless you, Nicodemus, become the recipient of the life of God that you say you see in me, you'll never see the kingdom of God. Until the life of God is restored to you, you'll not know his kingdom. Unless you are born again, or unless you are born from above, as literally it can be read. Let's go back to the older brother for a moment. He portrays the scribes and the Pharisees. And the essential relationship of the Son to the Father was a relationship of obedience. He said to him, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Now think about that. These many years I've served you, I never disobeyed your command. Think about that. Most of the hired servants of the Father could have said exactly the same thing. They could have said, these many years I've served you. When they come for their pay packet at the end of the week, with absolute genuineness, these many years I have served you, I never disobeyed your command. That would have been equally the relationship of a hard servant. The hard servant may not like him, of course. He may not sit at his table. It's unlikely he did. He may not have had intimate friendship with him. He probably didn't. He might just as soon take another job on another estate somewhere else if he was offered it and it had better conditions just as soon. But while he's here, he can say, I have served you and never disobeyed you. And the elder son has nothing more than that. The elder son has obedience to his father, and that supersedes any relationship with his father. Now the disobedient son comes running home. He could never say, these many years I've served you, I've never disobeyed you. His word would have to be, I'm so sorry I didn't serve you, and I have flatly disobeyed you in every possible way that I could. But he's come back into relationship with the Father. So the Pharisees didn't start that way, because good movements never start in that sort of corrupt way. They usually begin well with an inner spiritual concern and desire. But there is what I would call like a centrifugal force that's all the time pulling us away from the centrality of Christ and of God and of relationship, not just pulling us away from the centrality of Christological doctrine or Christian doctrine, but away from the person of Christ himself. It tries to pull us away from the spiritual to the human, or in the language of the New Testament, from the spiritual to the flesh, from the internal relationship to the external behavior patterns, from the divine life that is intended to indwell us to the divine law which instructs us, from living reality with God to simply dead ritual that we continue to participate in. And this has potential in all of our lives, including mine. A centrifugal force is always there trying to pull us away. Every Christian is in danger of this. If Christ ceases to be central in my life, then my Christian life will spiral off into all kinds of other possibilities and be lifeless. This is Pharisaism, represented by the oldest son. And he becomes bitter, he becomes jealous, he becomes angry. In verse 30, when this son of yours, he says to his father, when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. There's no pleasure on the part of the oldest son. His youngest brother has come home. There's no joy. His younger brother's come home. There's no welcome. His younger brother's come home. There's no love. His younger brother has come home. Only bitterness. And bitterness becomes a poison in the soul. You bitter in your marriage this morning? That is a very powerful little bottle of poison you're harboring. Are you bitter towards your children? Maybe they too have taken off and over the hills and gone, messed their lives up. Maybe they too are on the way back but no, I'm going to be the older brother, not the father. I'm going to be angry and bitter. Is there bitterness in our spiritual lives? Is there bitterness towards God? You know, it is precisely the pit into which the faithful, hardworking, loyal, obedient people who do the right thing will fall when they think that doing the right thing is itself the substance of their lives and their relationships. And this young man is resentful to his brother and resentful to his father. You know, there are two sons in the story, but the real hero in the story is the father. He's the real hero. Just a few minutes, finish with him. He represents God. And remember, God is Christ-like. God is like Jesus. How does he respond? Do you know, he never says an unkind word of rebuke to either son. That was the younger son. If you said to the younger son that night, if you went into his room very quietly, sat on the end of his bed and said, hey, is it good to be home? Was your dad pleased to see you? Was the neighborhood full of joy? We don't know anything about his mum, but if she was there, was your mum glad to hug you again? He would say yes, a resounding yes, and his mind would be saying, why? I do not deserve this, I do not deserve this, why? But I've received only welcome and only celebration and only joy. And the father goes to speak to the eldest son. He says, this brother of yours, you've got to bring him back into the fold of your own heart. He's your brother. And we know what happened to the younger son. We know he was repentant. We know he was fully embraced. We know he came back into the bosom of the home. We do not know what happened to the oldest son. Scripture remains silent about that. It was much harder for the oldest son, I suggest to you, than the younger son, because as Paul wrote, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. Goodness is a lot harder nut to crack than badness when it comes to the grace of God in people's lives. I often hear the term churched and unchurched. I never use it myself. People say, how do we reach the unchurched? Actually, the bigger problem are the churched. The boys who stayed at home. They're often the bigger problem in terms of their spirit that has grown within them and their view of the world and their judgmental, critical view of those around them, rather than that outpouring of compassion which the younger son will always have, because he'll always know this. Meeting anybody in every situation, I've been there. I understand. But home is better. Come home. Both these boys were lost. You know, in this parable, it's all about being lost. The sheep was lost, the coin was lost, the younger boy was lost, older son was lost. And Jesus said in Luke 19:10, the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. Think about this. It's a wonderful thing that Jesus described them as being lost. Do you know why? Because to be lost is to be wanted. You come here this morning and you drop a Coke can ring somewhere when you come into the building. You don't go to the welcome desk and say, I want to report I've lost the Coke can ring. If you lose your wedding ring here this morning, you'll be down to the welcome center. I've lost my wedding ring. And you won't leave this building till you've turned everything upside down and retraced every step until you've found it. What's the difference between a Coke can ring and a wedding ring? One is of value. When we're described as being lost, it's not a condescending word. It's an absolutely beautiful word. You're lost. And there's a father who wants to bring you home. Maybe the younger son. I had breakfast with 1 or 2 people yesterday morning who I think are here as well. And somebody asked the question, we were talking about this, and somebody asked the question, which son do you think you are? And the first person said, well, I think I'm the younger son. I see myself in the younger son. What about you? Yeah, I'm the younger son. What about you? Yeah, younger son. What about you? And it became apparent that everybody saw themselves as the younger son because he's the hero at the end. But actually, the younger son can grow into the older son. And I might have been the younger son. I'm in danger of being the older son. Which is why our hearts need to stay tender. You know, the biggest problem for the older son is that it was not fair. It was not fair the way the younger son was treated. And you know something? It was not fair. Mercy is never fair. Grace is never fair. If you want what is fair, you're not looking for the grace and mercy of Jesus. It's not fair. His father embraced them both. And the father is like Jesus. For God, the Father is Christ-like.
As we read in the parable today, God loves both sons and extends an invitation to both of them because both are lost. And the good news is that the Son of Man came to seek and save that which was lost. So whether you see yourself more in the younger son or the older son, there is a Father who wants to bring you home. Join us again for more clear biblical teaching here on Living Truth. We love to hear from you. Send your comments through our website, Living Truth is supported by viewers like you. Thanks to your financial participation, lives are being transformed through the gospel of Jesus Christ. Living Truth is a registered charity, and donations receive a tax receipt. To watch this message again, visit our website. Download transcripts, order DVDs and CDs, as well as our daily devotional, or sign up for our monthly newsletter. Online, you can sign up for podcasts. You can also join us on Facebook and YouTube. Join us next week for a message from Brett McBride called When Heaven Rejoices. This is Living Truth.
You hold the world in the palm of your hand. So who am I to think my trouble is too grand for you? When I can't move, when I'm bound in chains, there is freedom in your name. In the drought, you are the rain. Now I'm calling out to you again. Over and over I've fallen. Over and over you say. Over and over I've fallen short of holy, but you save me. Yeah, you save me.
Though I walk through the valley of shadows, or on this road with no tomorrows in sight,
You see me through until the end. What a king, oh, what a friend. On your goodness I can always
depend. So I'm calling out to you again.
over